We come to the seventh presentation, which is the pivot of the 13-part series. Not only is it at the center, but it's a pivot. If you're looking at it linearly, it's a fulcrum. And one could balance the first 6 presentations with the latter 6 presentations, but you would get a false set. We're dealing with consciousness, which is not linear. And if there needs to be a contrast, which immediately comes to an idea, the contrast would be, instead of linear, it is chiral. It has a pair of spirals, and that pair of spirals, when balanced, does not give a line, but gives instead an overlapping of fields. So that linearity actually is a subset of considerations, which means that the alignment of identity and identification is a subset, not the set, and especially not the harmonic of the set of sets. So that we're going to look at today a classic way in which our kind, over the last several thousand years, came to a very sophisticated understanding of this, and it has resurfaced in the last 100 years, and part of its resurfacing is in quantum theory. Now, the buzzword and the catchphrase currently in the early 21st century is to acquire zero-point energy. So I thought I would just refresh us by going back about 80 years to when it first surfaced. This large tome are the scientific papers of Arthur Holly Compton. And this is Compton here. He was born in Ohio, in a little town. His mother was Mennonite. His father was a principal of schools. And Arthur Compton grew up to be one of the world's greatest scientists. The Compton gamma ray satellite was named for him, a Nobel Prize winner. In the scientific papers of Compton, on page 656, this is 1931, electron distribution in argon and the existence of zero-point energy. Now, Compton was famous because he devised the first scattering spectrum from helium, which is a noble gas. And the noble gases are inert, meaning that they're perfectly balanced. And in that sequence, you have not only helium and neon, etc., but you have argon, radon as well, and so forth. The electron scattering spectrum of argon was instrumental in determining what was called 80 years ago zero-point energy. This was the beginning. And it reads this way, just so we can understand and begin to not only formulate for ourselves what it is that the presentation is about, but to recalibrate the formulation so that it does not become formulaic, which unfortunately has done. Data on the scattering of X-rays by argon reported by Whelan are analyzed by the method recently described by the writer, Compton himself. The resulting electron distribution curve, a U-curve, shows a maximum electron density at about 0.10 angstroms from the center of the atom. the data of James and Firth on rock salt, that's sodium chloride in its rock salt formulation, at 0 degrees Kelvin, 0 degrees K, absolute zero, give a maximum electron density of chlorine atoms at about 0.19 angstroms from the center, for 900 K at about 0.58 angstroms. The difference between the latter two values is due to the thermal motion of the atoms in the crystal. Similarly, the large difference between the radius of maximum electron density in the atoms of argon gas and of chlorine in rock salt at 0 K must mean motion of the chlorine ions in the crystal lattice. The amplitude of this motion is the order of magnitude predicted on the quantum theory of zero-point energy. This confirms the conclusions of Waller and Hartree, who, however, based their conclusion on a theoretical rather than an experimental electron distribution for argon and chlorine. The 0 point comes from the calibration of a temperature which drops to the beginning, which would be 0 degrees Kelvin. That at that temperature, the atom of sodium chloride, of rock salt, has its essential form by which its vibration, its vibronic coupling of its existential form as an atom is at its base. And that base is called then, 80 years ago, the 0 point. And that the energy would be the actual base, the basis of the energy of atomic structure, not only for sodium chloride, but any atom would at that 0 temperature have a universal energy reading, and that universal energy reading is how it comes into its energy frequency, not only in the first place, but all the time. Not statically at the first time, but kinetically, this is how it exists. One of the developments from that was Bose-Einstein condensate. That if you take an element like helium and reduce it down close to absolute zero, as it approaches the 0 point, which is a point in a line calibration of temperature, meaning also motion, meaning also time. That as you take helium down, or any atomic structure, more and more the atoms will not act individually or probabilistically in a statistical way. They will act as if they are all the same atom, the same structure. Out of this, of course, comes the development of principles of condensed matter physics. This is a textbook now almost 10 years old, and there have been swirls of development since then. What's important for us is that there are not only crystals of elements, but there are such things as molecular crystals. That our whole physiology of life, including DNA, which can be crystallized, and that one can have a magnetism and optics of molecular crystals. And further, there are such things as quasi-crystals, liquid crystals. Well, you get the drift. That if one is talking about a 0 point energy as the source for the existentiality of phenomenon and thus their energy, one seems very certain in one's mind that this is on the verge of leading somewhere, and it is deceptive. It is classically deceptive because the zero in this is not a 0 point, but is the threshold of zero as zero. It does not record. It has no linear progression whatsoever. The apparentness of a linearity of progression, of motion, of temperature, of energy then that would be accessible because you have the calibration of it. The zero here is actually a field and not a place of a point. The classic Western way of expressing it was Euclid in his original geometry. A point is a locus of no dimension. When it moves, the movement describes a line, and one can conceptualize the line by taking 2 points with the line in between. Whereas the actuality of it, if one were really being precise in language and refined, the 2 points are 2 locuses of no dimension, and the line movement then is an apparentness. Now, this was extremely difficult to be able to refine, and the person who refined it most beautifully was named Nagarjuna, who lived about 1900 years ago. He lived in South India, and his neighborhood was the Krishna River, coming off the Bay of Bengal and going inland into southern India. One branch of the Krishna loops up towards Hyderabad. The other branch swings over towards the coast on the Indian Ocean. One of the aspects that we need to remember and understand is that about 40 A.D., the Apostle Thomas, St. Thomas, was sent by Jesus to India via the trade routes from Egypt down the Red Sea from Myos Hormuz through what is today the pirate territory of the Somali, Yemen, Socotra, Aden area, and what used to be a long journey going along the coasts of southern Arabia and the coast of Iran to the Indus River were circumvented because the monsoon winds will take you directly across on the Indian Ocean so that one can sail directly from the Aden, Socotra area where Africa and Arabia almost touch. One can go in a direct line, but you do not go to the Indus basin of northern India. You go to near the tip of southern India. So that the trade routes were trade routes that did not go to Greco-Indian colonies in the north. They went to the industrial spice works in the south, ginger, cinnamon, pepper, etc. And this was very lucrative because you can get big bucks for small amounts, and so ships can carry an enormous amount of economic treasure for every trip, even though one can only go usually once a year when the monsoons are blowing one way and when the winds shift the other way. But you can, with enough ships and cargo, make very good profit. The family that controlled that trade route from Egypt, dominated by Alexandria, to India, dominated in the south, was the family of Philo of Alexandria. That family took the name Alexander because they were brought by Alexander the Great, along with a number of other talented Jews, because they were used for several thousand years to international trades, many different languages, many different values of money, many different kinds of commodities, and they were useful if you're going to have a world empire, to know how to run it and make it economically viable, but also by people who were able, because they were not of any particular region, they were of their own religion, but they were able to ratio in negotiations, in deal making with anybody else, because any and everybody else to them was a potential customer. So the family was named Alexander, but they also helped, some centuries later, Julius Caesar in his Alexandrian War to victory, and so the family adopted the middle name Julius, and so all the family members after that were known as somebody Julius Alexander. Philo's two nephews, sons of his brother, were named Marcus Julius Alexander and Tiberius Julius Alexander. Tiberius Julius Alexander grew up to be one of the greatest generals in the Roman Empire, and he was the top general next to Vespasian's son Titus, who were the ones who laid siege to Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. So it was Philo's nephew who was responsible for taking the temple out of history. And his family was also responsible for taking the Apostle Matthew down to Ethiopia, of taking Thomas to India, and various other shipping routes. What comes out of this is that South India was the first place that received a recalibration of the way in which the dimensions of consciousness actually worked, and worked in an ecology of transformation. And about 10 years after Thomas arrived, was born in India, Nagarjuna. He lived to be 100 years old, so he lived from about 50 AD to about 150 AD. Extremely important. It's important for us because Nagarjuna and an older contemporary named Ashvaghosha were the ones that transformed Buddhism from the old way, the Theravada, to the new way, the great way, the Mahayana. And the Mahayana has a Hellenistic, Jewish, earlier than the church Christianity. It was Jesus' way that was familiar to the trading companies in South India that went from the west coast to the east coast, and in between those two coasts, which are very close together at the point of South India, you will find a city called Salem, like Jerusalem. And it is always there. And in what used to be the great city on the Bay of Bengal, it used to be called Madras, about 5-6 million people now, it's called Chennai, is St. Thomas Hill, where the Apostle Thomas is buried and has been buried all this while. Nagarjuna comes out of the first generation of insight that one has to understand something almost beyond description, yet it can be analyzed. And by putting those two aspects together, one gets the kind of quandary that quantum mechanics, quantum physics, generates for us over the last 80, 90 years. You cannot describe adequately ever a quantum activity, but one can analytically approach it indefinitely with accuracy. This is one of the hallmarks of it. Nagarjuna, in living almost 100 years, wrote many volumes which are still used in the Mahayana as the recalibration of the way in which understanding is refined by the dimensions of consciousness. One of the classic works of Nagarjuna is called the 70 Stanzas, and the 70 Stanzas actually is 70 stanzas on emptiness. Out of the 70, I've chosen 4 to give us a quick glimpse at the way in which consciousness understood about 1900 years ago in the great way, reads in translation this way. This is number 46 of the 70. Actually, there are 73. A form cannot have the fourfold nature of the elements, because if the form has 4 elements, then it will be fourfold, and the 4 elements cannot have a singular form, or else they will become like form. So how can form arise from the 4 great elements as its cause? What is peculiar here? And one has to now exceed the calibration of mentality in order to first appreciate it, then to analyze it, and then thirdly to understand it. In other words, the understanding is going to be an interpretation after an analysis, but the analysis is going to proceed from an insight appreciation, which will then recursively go back to the symbolic structure that posed an original calibration that now has to be refined. It has to be recalibrated. And this is an extremely difficult thing to do, but it's also the simplest thing in the world if you know how to do 2 things. If you know how to read and how to write. Because the only way that one can take a scroll or a tablet or a screen or a book and read is that the symbols must be transparent to you. You cannot look at the ink on the page, on the paper. You cannot look at the individual letters on the paper, or even the individual words for most of the time. Reading is a continuous cascade of the symbols that have become transparent, so that when one reads through the words, one reads through the sentences, through the language, to the visioning of what is being said. And one hears what is being said without any sound in your mind, usually. Now, in Roman schools, when almost everyone was masculine, boys were taught to read their Virgil, their Horace, and so forth. They were taught that you have to read out loud. And if you were caught reading silently, you were whacked with the discipline stick. Because the Romans were very suspicious of something having voices in the mind, instead of manly-like of having the voices of oratorial declamation, which is how you made your money as a senator, as a lawyer, as a general, as someone of power in the Roman Empire. One had to be able to speak, and so one memorized to be able to speak out loud, but not to remember silently through the words what the meaning was. Because what the meaning is when you silently read to yourself, it makes a new dimension to the mind. The dimension that comes into play is the fifth dimension, not something of space-time, but of consciousness as a dimension. One begins to be able to envision through the reading. But there is a further dimension that comes into play, and that is, having learned to read, one now can learn to write. One can learn to write from a compositional, visionary field, and one's writing now is not a manipulation of rote rules, but is an original composing quality, which we traditionally have called poetry. If you compose by linearity, by rules, by tropes of symbolic structure, you can achieve a kind of rhetoric. You can have lists, you can have signs that come together and formulate then ensembles. You can have laws, you can have codes, but you do not get poetry. You do not get art. You do not get the free flow of the appreciation of the ability to communicate silently from someone having written and you having read, are now able to originally write for yourself as a development of this. Nagarjuna goes further in the 70 stanzas. This is 51 and 52, just a few stanzas later. The I has no consciousness because the I is a form, but I consciousness is formless. And that which is formless cannot adhere to form. In the same way, the form which is observed has no I consciousness, nor is it between I and form. Because I consciousness is generated in independence on I and form, if it is apprehended as having inherent existence, that is a mistaken conception. Here is the breaking point of linearity, of mentality, that finds that it cannot go beyond that outline of form, that conception of identification leading back to the things of the world, the actions of the world. So that in the mind, the essence and the existence are linked together by experience, but that experience is conditionable so that one can put a parenthesis around it. The parentheses of the mental idea, the principle, the laws, the doctrines, and the things and the actions which now are correspondent to the dictation from the symbolic structure. We only do these kinds of actions at these times and in this way. We only have these kinds of things that we deal with, other things we don't deal with. And in this way, experience becomes codified. But its codification is by a limitation of the flow, and the flow is the flow of experience, which means that what is edited, what is filtered more and more, by the way, are the images which one can use to think and use to correlate and identify what's possible what's approved, what's impossible, forbidden, so that images become codified, feelings become standardized, and it shows up most radically in language, which becomes not only stylized, but it becomes, we used to use the phrase in the 50s, freeze-dried. It's no longer fresh at all. So that one gets used to this kind of freeze-dried pablum talk, which doesn't ever allow one to walk. No one can walk that talk because it doesn't move. It has increasingly a static certainty, which, if we try to unlimber ourselves, the entire cycle becomes antagonistic to that effort. One says, if you do such and so, then it will blow your mind. It will explode your identity. It will make chaotic the whole identification of things. You will not fit in. And not only that, but if you continue to do this, you will not ever be able to fit in again. You will be not only an outlaw, but you will be cast out. Nagarjuna, 1900 years ago, writes this: "The I has no consciousness, but I consciousness is formless." If one looks at one's own eye in a mirror, one is habituated to see the identification. How do I look today? If you look into another person's eyes while they are looking into your eyes, and you do not look to just see them, but let the looking interpenetrate with their looking, what comes out of that in a primordial way is the experience that babies have when their eyes first focus and they're able to see you. They smile. Almost all babies will smile. Almost all puppies or kittens, even little baby hippos. I remember seeing a baby rhinoceros in the LA Zoo about 30 years ago, and it played all the time. It would scamper into the mud. It would get itself all muddy, run to the mother, and throw the mud off in shivers, and then scamper back to get more and keep on doing this. Even little baby rhinos play. It is in the play of consciousness, because the field of consciousness is infinite and is not opposite to or excluded from the zero field of nature. It isn't just that consciousness and nature go together like ham and eggs. They were never not together. Hence, time in nature and time in consciousness are both eternal, but the eternity of natural time is a zero field, and in consciousness it's an infinite field. So that you begin to see that the interpenetration of the fields of consciousness as a dimension and the field of nature as a zero is revelatory that nature, qua nature in its zero field, does not register in space-time at all. That space-time has occurred not out of that, but occurs within that. And so is an image only when it moves. Plato in the Timaeus has a beautiful timeless phrase. He says in the Timaeus, in English translation, time is the moving image of eternity. And if it moves, time now creates segmentation within a field that has no segmentation whatsoever. So that time is the first binding of the cycle of forms. But its cycle of forms is posited on whatever emerges within the zero field has oneness because it is surrounded on every side, in every way, by zeros, so that its one can stand out. And so extant is standing out. Literally, it means standing forth. Ecstasis. So that existence is an ecstatic occurrence within the zero field of nature and becomes playful in the zero infinity of consciousness. One of the structures that's in symbolic thought is the imagination. In the high Mahayana, when it first became expressed by Ashvaghosha, he used a phrase that translates as the storehouse consciousness. The image base. All of the images that one has encountered, that one has seen, worked into one's experience, has an indelible registry. And so the imagination, while it seems limited and stylized by the filterings and the various approaches by the linear mentality, one can go through meditations. There are contemplations. There are prayer vigils that disclose the indelibility of the images. I talked a couple of weeks ago of an experience one time in, it was in the summertime above Lake Tahoe. In the wintertime, it's Heavenly Valley ski area. It's about 10,000 feet, and Lake Tahoe is about 3,000 feet down. And I was determined at that time to make sure, check myself out, that my discipline of meditative capacity to resolve was in working order. I was trying to give up smoking and trying to find out why I smoked. And out of my rucksack, which I flung down, seeing this big rock in a little grove of cottonwood trees up there, some pines, and it, out of the rucksack, flipped a little can of juice, grapefruit juice, and a glint of sunlight came off one of the ends of this flipping can. The rucksack landed about 35 feet away because I was really determined. It went deep into a high-powered samadhi, and all of a sudden, out of the kind of liquid gray, it took form as a little oval, and it had blue letters that read sun-kissed. So I leapt off that rock, grabbed that can, looked at it, and sure enough, it was a can of sun-kissed grapefruit juice. I had caught the entirety of the brand name in its script in a glint of sunlight out of the corner of my eye in less than a hundredth of a second, and was able to resolve it. You can do this. When this is done, one is able not to come to a 0 point, but one is able to come to the threshold where space-time no longer registers. It will occur, and later, recursively, one can find out that it occurred because one can then creatively remember what has been going on. It still was sunlight, the lake, the temperature, etc. Consciousness and nature as fields are indelible in the sense of beyond time limitations. Let's take a little break. Let's come back to a contrast which we can think about, and then with the contrast, by adding a third element to it, we begin to get an appreciation. Rather than just the contrast, we now have a three-part quality. In the classic wisdom tradition, the third quality was to integrate the neutral so that one had contrasts, but one had the neutral, the equanimity. The mistaking of the neutral with a zero is a high water mark of true ignorance. But what is of even more startling revelation about consciousness is keynoted by the quotation that the authors, the two Tibetans and the American, in their translation of Nagarjuna's 70 stanzas on emptiness. The quotation reads this way: "Reality, according to Buddhists, is kinetic, not static. But logic, on the other hand, imagines a reality stabilized in concepts and names. The ultimate aim of Buddhist logic is to explain the relation between a moving reality and the static constructions of thought." T. Shtcherbatsky, Buddhist Logic, Volume 2, page 2. He was a Russian genius early on, and you can find the 2 volumes of Buddhist Logic in Dover paperback reprints. He also did 2 volumes, the conception of Buddhist nirvana and the central conception of Buddhism. Notice that all of these have conception, logic and conception. And by the way, if one wants to go to a really refined presentation, Shtcherbatsky did his work back at the beginning of the 20th century in the 1920s. One can come to something at the in 1969, Buddhist formal logic. This time, a study of Dignaga's great work on the way in which a logic conditions the rhetoric of conception. One cannot undo that piecemeal. It must be dissolved. And the ancient word that we still use for that dissolving is solution. It is not the sort of puzzle that can be put together and one gets the picture, because the whole process of making the picture is the knot. My work has been to find a language, to find a way to recalibrate the entirety of the problem so that answers are not sought, but solutions obtained. In my recalibration, which goes back to these forebearers, as well as to the contemporary forebearers, is to introduce phases so that the natural cycle can be given its frame of reference, its picture, in the sense that the mind can approve of it, that its alignments, its identifications, its linearities are all there and they're satisfied. But the further dimensions of consciousness, which are not in that cycle, they're not of that cycle, they are an ecology that when it comes into play always transforms the natural cycle. So instead of having the frame of reference, one has the rapidity of many frames of reference, and one gets a motion picture. One gets cinematographic, which puts us very close as we get cinematographic in our symbolic structures. It gets very close to being able to appreciate transparency, which has become a buzzword as well. 0 point energy, transparency. Yet, all of these are words and languages that are very close, but they do not touch the further dimensions of consciousness. And the reason why they do not touch is because consciousness is a differential field. If you bring an integral structure or any part of an integral structure into contact with the differential field of consciousness, what immediately occurs spontaneously is that there is a recalibration. In order to have a quantification, in order to have a quanta, the unity must stand forth from the zero field of nature. And so it is surrounded by zeroness. There are paradoxical books on the emptiness of emptiness. But it isn't just that there's a transparency of the form. The form itself becomes a deceptive imposition. And one gets, after a while, there's a tang, there's a existential taste that one is being deceived or one is deceiving oneself. The classic development of Nagarjuna that came about 500 years later, the great wisdom conscious sage was named Chandrakirti. Chandra is moon in Sanskrit. His little classic is the Sevenfold Reasoning, Meditation on the Selflessness of Persons. And Chandrakirti, like Nagarjuna, extraordinarily capable of the entire ecology of consciousness, so that instead of all of the individual parts of unities, and each of the parts must be a unity. Each molecule must be a unity. It's H2O, it's water. Each atomic structure must be a unity. Each particality used to be called corpusculars. Stuff, the stuff out of which when the electron was first discovered by J.J. Thomson, he wrote a little book on the corpuscular nature of the electron. It's a body. Immensely fleeting, very difficult, but finally one gets to see, wow, it's 1,876th the mass of a proton, which is also something. So the thusness of things, and also the thusness of action, which is why there's a karma. But that things stand forth as unities means they're surrounded by zero, so they carry zeroness with them all the time. But because it doesn't register, we don't sense the zeroness until we become acclimated consciously. But in doing so, consciousness also does not identify, but because it has a differential field, does not surround the items, the unities, the thusness with zeros, but with infinity. Infinities. Which is why in the higher math of quantum physics, quantum electrodynamics, QED, quantum chromodynamics, QCD, all the time, the math shows up infinities. And we'll get back to that next week when we talk about the illogic of much of the math. Chandrakirti goes to a trope which goes back before him about 1,000 years. It goes back to Plato, and it goes back to the Katha Upanishad, which were both composed about the same time. Plato's dialogue, the Republic, came out in about 375 BC, the Katha Upanishad about the same time. The trope is to use a chariot as the symbol by which one can make an explication that the mind initially has an image base for and a memory for, but can participate then in the conscious dissolve of the image symbol so that its constituent parts also go into solution. With this caveat, when you use higher dimensions of consciousness, they initially dissolve the forms of the mind, but the higher one goes in those dimensions, they evaporate them. There's a difference. In one, they go into a solution so that a new form can come out. It's like an alchemy. In the higher registry, it's like vaporizing. There is no form. So that one gets eventually out of that vaporizing, that evaporation, not into nothingness, but into infinity, one comes to a third kind of form. And the best name for that third kind of form is hyperspace. 10-dimensional hyperspace. And we'll talk about Michio Kaku, superstrings, M theory as we go on. Here's Chandrakirti's sevenfold reasoning by which to dissolve the certainty of forms and of parts of forms out of their thusness into the initial solution where they do not have a form. And here is the way he did it. Number one, there is no chariot which is other than its parts. 2, there is no chariot which is the same as its parts. 3, there is no chariot which inherently possesses its parts. There is no chariot which inherently depends on its parts. There is no chariot upon which its parts are inherently dependent. 6, there is no chariot which is the mere collection of its parts. And 7, there is no chariot which is the shape of its parts. In dissolving this symbol with its imagery, the imagery goes back into the matrix out of which it occurred. And the matrix out of which it occurred is in the flow of experience. And one comes to appreciate and eventually analyze and eventually understand that if the imagery goes back into its base of the flow of experience, what also accompanies by correspondence those images are the feelings, the feeling tones. So that more and more there is an odd sense that used to be called, and habitually is still called, detachment. And that when there is no image, one has no feeling about it. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, by about 1910, the first artist, really great, planetary class artist, Condensed, Wassily Condensed, developed the first understanding and appreciation of abstract art. That the images, he was able to dissolve the feeling tones associated, he was able to dissolve, and what was left to him at that time in that initial movement was color. So that the feeling tones then were able to be in just pure color. And he wrote about this magisterially. A little book on the spiritual in art. It's reprinted in a translation by Dover Paperbacks for about a couple of bucks, less than 100 pages. But the abstractness still in Kandinsky has non-objective art. It still has color and feeling tones. And he was able to work with this because the Impressionists like Monet and Renoir especially, but especially Monet, were able to see that if you have, like for Monet, it was a series of painting the same thing, the same frame, at different times of the day. One of the great examples is he painted a haystack. And he did 6 versions of a haystack at different times of the day, or different times on different days, but the same haystack. Or he went to Rheims and saw the cathedral there, and he did several different versions of this same facade of the cathedral at Rheims, But what one was able to see was that the impression was not an impression of form. It was an impression of the play of color, and that the feeling tones that came out of the play of color in images or the play of color in abstract art was that the observer became almost affine in a spontaneous way with the artist. One did not see the work of art in between the artist and the audience, the appreciator. That the art had become transparent, like language written becomes transparent, that one is able then to carry that with oneself. And you had a new aesthetic that came into play, which had a new quality of the individual that came into play. And it wasn't so much that the artist was an individual, but that their creative person was prismatic, and that the work of art was a facet or many facets of the prismatic artist. And that there is not just a swirl, but there is a spiraling swirl that occurs, and that the movement of how one is looking, how one is seeing, composes the work as the looking occurs. And the more that one goes back through it, the more that the composition emerges. So that, noting Condensed again, he began to do a series, like Monet had done a series on haystacks or a series on the cathedral facade of Rheims. He did a series called Compositions. And he did 10 compositions over some period of years. And the 10th composition is magisterial, but is so complex and so large that it is difficult to attend to it with a long enough duration for the appreciation to mature. There was an exhibit here at the Los Angeles County Museum of Condensed one time, and they had Composition 10, and it was mishung. It was because it was so large, it was put up so that everyone could look up at it. But the room was too small, you couldn't get an aesthetic distance so that one could get the appreciation juices. It's like serving a beautiful gourmet soup, and you have the ladles to try and eat it with. This in the opposite way. And it was mislit so that only by standing underneath it could you see the true colors without the glares. What happens, as Chandrakirti is pointing out, that when you have the ability consciously to carry your infinities with you, the forms are no longer integral. They're all differential because they're presented in infinity not as quanta, but as possibilities. Every aspect is not only possible, but is infinitely possible. So that when the experience from an artist or someone whose person is as prismatic as the artist, when they do things, their experience is not just a flow of experience on rollers of images with feeling-toned gusto and a language which then characterizes it thus and so. What happens is that one learns that you compose kaleidoscopically. Your experience is now kaleidoscopic consciousness. And this is exactly the fruitful play out of which a true science can emerge. Because without a kaleidoscopic historical consciousness, you cannot have experiment which refines and enlarges experience in such a way to satisfy the analytic, harmonic development of a theory. And here is where the refinement of my work comes into play, especially to recalibrate so that we do not fall into the habit of thinking that theory takes place in the symbolic structure of thought. Theory does not happen in mentality. It's not the same as an idea. Theory is a prismatic insight in the quintessential fifth dimension of consciousness, in the field of consciousness. Theory emerges as the prismatic nexus of possibilities, like a matrix, of possibilities which can be brought together prismatically by someone, not only having the theory, but expressing the theory as in the same way as having learned to read, you then learn to write. So that someone who develops a theory and expresses it so that it can be experimented with and analyzed from that is endeavoring as an artist. And so the conscious person is an artist. Not only at the time or even all the time, but never not without time limitations. So that there is a quality of one way that Aldous Huxley talked about the Upanishads. He said they were the breath of eternity. Once you breathe in that way, you come to appreciate that you are breathing pure freedom. In the sense that it's not a transcendence of something, or even the super context out of which all things can come, but that freedom is the freedom of eternity, and that all possibilities are possible. So that consciousness has a peculiar, differential, conscious field in its infinity that until you get used to being prismatic in it, and by refining oneself to have more and more facets so that your prism becomes not just a crystal, but becomes jewel-like. Until you mature to have that jewel-like radiance where the joy effervesces, the initial trying to put it back into experience as a flow, trying to reform the symbolic structures as change your mind, trying to readjust the ritual actions which you do, the selection of things which you're working with, you get into a true quandary. And it was pointed out beautifully by Nagarjuna about the eye. The great American medicine visionary sage Black Elk said, white men get lost in the dark of their eyes. They do not see nature. They only see what they want to do with it. They do not see themselves. They work to enforce what their idea of themselves and its power and its spread would be. And anyone who takes the time to read something like Black Elk Speaks, he talks about the initial encounter with visioning when he was a boy, about 8 years old. And how that refined itself throughout his life. And even when he was in Europe with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, dancing before the Queens of England and the Netherlands, he still had his visionary maturity. And I'll bring next week a photograph of Black Elk near the end of his life in a sepia-toned photograph, an original, taken by Manly Hall in Denver, Colorado in 1945 at the end of World War II. And Black Elk in his full regalia, his long chief's feathers and his calumet, signaling the world to mature into not just peace, but into the conscious visioning that it takes refined persons who are prismatic together in prismatic communities to make sure that the peace is not a static piece of documents, but is a radiant exploration of reality in terms of kaleidoscopic discovery. And that a logic which reduces the static to its ultimate formulations is completely belayed if identification is not possible. And with infinite possibilities, identification is not possible. Hence the development, as we will see next week especially, of calculus was an integral calculus and a differential calculus at the same time. And that there are infinitesimal gradations between 0 and 1, and between 1 and 0. And that until one recalibrates, that like seeing the haystack in all the different times of the day as a set, or the Cathedral of Reims and all of its different climates and moods and so forth as a set. The images do not achieve a resonant set, and the harmonic of that resonant set is not apparent, because the harmonic occurs because one is able to analyze. Harmonic analysis. What the basis of a harmonic analysis is an aesthetic resonance. And linking them together is a kaleidoscopic conscious flow, and that flow is actually what history is. So it is not a misnomer that God used to be called the Lord of History. Yeah. About the time that Nagarjuna, about 150 AD, was able to have presented the recalibration of working conscious ecology into Buddhism, you began to get a new kind of a sutra. This is just a couple of lines from the Lotus Sutra, the Lotus of the Wonderful Law. I veritably became Buddha, and there passed infinite, boundless, hundreds, thousands, myriads, kotis, nayuktas of kalpas. For instance, suppose there were 500,000 myriad kotis, nayutas of numberless 3,000 great thousandfold worlds. Let someone grind them to atoms. Pass eastward through 500,000 myriads kotis, nayutas of numberless countries, and then drop one of those atoms. Suppose he thus proceeded eastward till he had finished those atoms. What do you think, good sons? Is it possible to imagine and calculate all those worlds so as to know their number? And this from Jesus, composed about 150 AD in the Pistis Sophia, the Faith Wisdom, 84th chapter. Truly, truly, I say to you, the 24 invisible ones are lighted 10,000 times more than the light of the sun, which is in this world, as I have already said to you at another time. For the light of the sun in its true form is not in this place, because its light passes through a multitude of veils and places. But the light of the sun in its true form, which is in the place of the Virgin of the Light, is lighted 10,000 times more than the 24 invisible ones, and the great invisible forefather, and the great triple-powered God, as I have already said to you at another time. Now at this time, Mary Magdalene, there is no kind in this world, nor light, nor form, which comprises and compares with the 24 invisible ones, with which I can compare them. But yet a little while, and I will take thee with thy brothers and fellow disciples to all the places of the height, and I will take you to the three spaces of the first mystery, with the exception only of the places of the space of the ineffable, and you will see all their forms in truth without semblance. And when I take you to the height, and you shall see the glory of those of the height, you will be exceedingly great amazement. And when I take you to the place of the archons of the Hymarmene, you shall see the glory in which they are, and as a result of their exceeding great glory, you will reckon this world before you as darkness of darkness. And you will look upon the whole world of mankind, and it will become the size of a speck of dust before you as a result of great distance. Then he goes from that amplitude to the next expansion and says the previous amplitude will become a speck of dust. And he does that 7 times. And he says, the place of those in the midst will count before you as night in the world of mankind. And when you look forth upon the midst, it will become the size of a speck of dust. At the same time, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in India, with the Mahayana, is a third resonance in the far Celtic west of Europe, of England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and you have a penetrating, visionary cycle that goes from Ireland to India, from Ethiopia into Scythia. And in this kind of lens-like prism, about 100 years after the resurrection, you get a kaleidoscopic harmonic that took almost another 500 years for it to develop and open up in such a way that the full resonant set was established in terms of what was initially available as a harmonic. To think that history is just a linearity or even a cycle is deceptive until we realize that there is a spiraling in and a spiraling out at the same time. One of the sweetest little collections of books on the mystic spiral, Journey of the Soul, is by Jill Peirce, who edited this series for Thames and Hudson. There are about 30 volumes in this. She was as beautiful artist and visionary as she was as a woman. Next week, we're going to take a look at the way in which American Indian languages allowed for a development of an expressive aesthetic of understanding how it is that a high poetic, Yeats called it a high talk, is able finally to characterize in such a way that the cosmos becomes resonant to our prisms as persons, as communities, as planets, as star systems, as galaxies. Until our cluster of galaxy is so far removed that it's less than a speck of dust, it still obtains. Chandrakirti's great commentary, translated as the ocean of nectar, because it was influential eventually in founding the Gelugpa order in Tibet under Tsongkhapa, and the Dalai Lama is the head of the Gelugpa order. There is a harmonic between Jesus, St. Thomas, Ashvaghosha, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Tsongkhapa, the Dalai Lamas, and our lives now in a complete recalibration. That's what's going on here. More next week.